Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the sound bites. Joining me today is Ben Kinsley, who's our Executive Director of Campaign for Vermont, and co-host and co-producer. A lot of titles, Ben.
I know.
Yes, there you go. And to my left is Mark Whitworth, who's President of Energize Vermont. Mark, welcome to the show. I know this is your first time. And a repeat guest, Annette Smith, who's the Executive Director for Vermonters for a Clean Environment. Annette, welcome back.
Annette, thank you for being here.
I'm very excited. I heard you at the Rotary. This is not in the script here. I heard you in the Rotary. You were amazing. And I was sitting at a table with two people who I would have told you hands down, no. By the time you were finished, they were rethinking their position, which was very interesting knowing these people. So
that was fun.
Yeah, that was good. They were really paying attention.
I always appreciate the opportunity to educate.
Yeah, there you go. So today we're talking mostly about wind power because that's been in the papers and in everybody's mind, but also like to throw in a little discussion about alternative energy sources. So that it's customary, as you know, to talk a little bit about yourself so our guests know who you are. So Mark, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, well, I live in Newark. I got involved in, up in the kingdom, I got involved in this issue about wind and about renewables in 2012 when a wind developer proposed a 100 megawatt wind project that would have divided and fragmented the second largest wildlife habitat block in the state. And it was also going to encroach on my town. So I've been involved in this for 5 or 6 years now.
Good for you. Well, we thank you for that. We've had several shows on a few of those projects over the last 2 years. Annette?
Well, let's see. I'm Executive Director of Vermonters for a Clean Environment, which has been in existence for 18 years and was founded dealing with a proposed $1 billion natural gas power plant and pipeline project. So we started out working on energy issues, then we ended up working on a lot of water-related issues, but all with the common theme of sort of the interface between residential and industrial. So quarries, large farms, landfills. The wind issue came back in 2009, or came to us in 2009, when a big project was proposed for an area in Rutland County. And the way that Vermonters for a Clean Environment works is very different from the way most environmental advocacy groups work. We don't just get money to do a policy piece. We respond to Vermonters who reach out to us. And nobody had reached out to us about wind. And then we have a protocol we look at and whether or not we take on projects. And we were actually besieged by people on both sides saying, please get involved promoting it, please get involved opposing it. And so I embarked on my own education to understand what the issues are. And so now 8.5 years later, let's see, last year I was brought under criminal investigation by the Attorney General's office for practicing law without a license, which then ultimately resulted in 5 newspaper editorials saying if she's a pain in the neck, more power to her. Right. And then I was named Vermonter of the Year by the Burlington Free Press.
Congratulations for
that. For someone who doesn't go out seeking notoriety, it's certainly come to me as a result of the dynamics that exist in this state regarding wind energy.
Well, I must say, when I read that David Blittersdorf, who we haven't had on the show yet, we've been working on that, said that you've got the lowest carbon footprint of anybody that he knows in Vermont. And maybe you could explain just a little bit about that you practice what you preach.
Well, I live off-grid with solar, and I have for 30 years, and I work out of a home office, and I don't commute to work, and I hand milk a cow and grow most of my own food and have solar hot water for not only heating water but for heat in my office. I have a greenhouse with citrus trees in it. So, but where that statement came from was a meeting that he called in about 2003. Just up the hill here was at Necky back then. And it was a nicely catered meeting. I bet. And he had invited the executive directors of every environmental group in the state and said, we're all over the place on wind and we need to come together. And it was a very interesting meeting to see where the different organizations were at the time. And then at the end, he gave he was going to give a prize for the person with the lowest carbon
Oh,
footprint.
there you go.
And so one by one, as people started to check off the boxes, I ended up with the prize, which was an extra, extra large T-shirt, which kind of is, you know, what kind of a present is that?
Something to sleep in, something comfortable. That's funny. Anyway.
That is funny. So could each of you explain a little bit about your organizations and what you're trying to achieve and what their missions are? Maybe Annette, we can start with you.
Well, you know, as I said, we're not a policy-oriented organization, and we respond to the issues that Vermonters bring to us. And it's classless, it's not partisan. We work with people from all walks of life. And so our sort of, not our formal mission statement, but our mission is to raise the voices of Vermonters and hold corporations accountable for their actions in their communities. So we do a variety of things. We assist people in participating in the regulatory process. We are very good at helping communities organize around issues that help them figure out what they want to do. And but our actual mission is to preserve the small town economics and environment of Vermont. So we actually are I guess we're the only environmental organizations that have economics in our mission statement, and to make smart choices.
That's great. Yes, sir.
Well, Energize Vermont is a policy organization. Our job is to educate and advocate sensible energy policies for Vermont, sustainable energy development that protects our environment and respects our communities. And you know, I like Annette's story about the carbon footprint. I don't know what my carbon footprint is, but I drive as little as possible, which is too much. And we generate all of our electricity with solar.
Oh, do you?
Well, we sell solar in the daytime, and we buy back whatever.
Right, off the grid.
Grid power at night. And we heat with wood and heat our water with wood. But, you know, we're concerned about climate change, but we don't view climate change as an abstraction where we're concerned about atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. We're concerned about the impacts that climate change is going to have on Vermont and Vermonters. And we're concerned that the plans that people have to mitigate carbon emissions are actually exacerbating the impacts that climate change is going to have on Vermont.
Well, you're going to have to explain that
Oh,
a
I
little
think
bit more
I see.
to me.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting,
lost me.
actually. I think you know, you have to be careful when you're talking about you know, emissions and also with global warming, because global warming or excuse me, climate change is going to affect different communities differently, right? And one of the things that, you know, Vermont's not necessarily going to be directly affected by sea level rise, but we will be affected by a warming climate in terms of, you know, our snow and our ski industry, and also in precipitation levels. We're expected to within the next 50 years to start seeing an increase in precipitation. Whether
It's
that's
already happening.
and it's already happening. Whether that's rain or snow, and that
Or
definitely
flooding in the basement.
exactly more flooding potentially and other effects. So I think it's interesting to put it in that context.
Well, that's exactly right. One of the things that we're concerned about is the impact on Vermont of an increased number of severe weather events and more severe weather events. Now, if we're concerned about that, then we should be preserving our natural defenses against those impacts. Mm-hmm. And so the greatest defenses we have are our undeveloped mountains and high elevation lands. So if we develop our ridge lines with wind turbines or any other kind of development, what we're doing is we're creating a stormwater problem that is going to impact the lowlands below that. And we're going to be increasing the vulnerability of our farms, our homes, our businesses, and our infrastructure to severe weather events. And that's probably not what we want to be doing. So in service to a lowering our greenhouse gas emissions, we're actually exacerbating the very problem that we're trying to avoid.
Right.
Other problems that we see, other impacts of climate change on Vermont will be a loss of food security. The same severe weather events that are going to impact our infrastructure are going to jeopardize our farmlands. We're also seeing a wholesale conversion of farmland over to energy production. Now, we don't really know what kind of impact nationwide or globally climate change is going to have on our food supply. But one thing that we know for sure is that Vermonters are going to want more of their food locally grown. Right. Another impact that we're going to see, we're already seeing, is animals, all kinds of species are going to have to be adapting to climate change. If we close off avenues that enable them to adapt to a changing climate, we're going to accelerate their extinction. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what we're doing with high elevation development.
This is already a concern, talking with some of the hunters and trappers and those communities. Right. This is already a concern about how connected our wildlands are, where we have these deer and moose and bear populations that are fairly migratory. They move throughout the seasons, but they're in isolation. We have fairly major roads that cut off all of our major forests from each other. So there's really no movement back and forth between these populations. And when they are moving, it's oftentimes across major roadways like Route 7 or I-89 or I-91. So it's an interesting, issue when you start looking at it. And something I just heard this afternoon on NPR, they were talking about a community of Native Americans that's in Washington State. They're right up against the coast. They have a 1 square mile preserve. And the problem was 75% of that reserve was in the tsunami floodplain. And their major concern is that they haven't had an earthquake along the Pacific Crest fault line since the early 1900s, but their seismic activity is indicating that there's going to be another one within the next 10 or 15 years. And because they're in the tsunami floodplain, they're trying to move all of their critical infrastructure away from the ocean to higher ground. So things like schools, their municipal buildings, their community centers, so that they're less vulnerable to either a seismic event or to global warming trends and ocean rise.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you, Vermont is so small. What can we really legitimately do to move the needle? Is it possible for us to have an impact, or to do the best we can, as you're saying, to protect ourselves and to prepare for any change?
Well, yeah, we are small, and our energy consumption per capita is small. We could reduce our carbon footprint to zero, and it would have very little impact.
Right, that's what
globally.
I've read. Once again, a tiny little grain of sand somewhere.
Yeah,
but there is another side to this, though, and that is that as other parts of the planet become less habitable, we have water, and so we could see an influx of what are called climate refugees as people leave other places to come to Vermont.
Right. Which then tap our resources and all of that.
Which,
right?
You can talk about the Utah guy who is talking about a community of 1 million people.
Right.
Down in
Yes, down
Vermont.
when he's buying all the land down.
Yeah, so that's not an outrageous thing. Vermont has had cycles of influx and egress from the state. And so, the things that we have of value that are so important, especially are our mountains, which have the purest water on Earth.
I'll confess something. I was a little into the pro side of this discussion until I realized that they blow up tops of mountains to make it flat to put the wind towers, and I said those things don't grow back if you take the wind tower down. So that's a resource that's gone.
Well, the degradation of our ridgelines is something that Vermonters for a Clean Environment's been looking at, especially at the Lowell site, where last year we conducted an investigation, and then this year we went back and checked again. And I was up on that ridgeline before it was destroyed, and it was one of the most beautiful, moss-covered, just dripping with water, with piles of moose dung everywhere. It had so much life, you know, so much chi. And now, because of the road networks, which were in some cases built because they were in a hurry, they had 4 different crews working, so they wanted to make sure the roads were wide enough that 2 trucks could pass.
Right.
So it's a very large road network, and it's like 2.5 miles up to the mountain and then 4 miles along the ridgeline. And all of that is now hot rock in the summer. And so all of those cool, wet headwaters are completely rearranged. The water's flowing in different directions. The stormwater system in some areas is failing. There is all kinds of iron flock coming out. There are trees dying. They were using large quantities of herbicides up on the mountain. So we, you know, it's not what I thought renewable energy development was going to look like. And it is a forever thing. I mean, they compare these to logging roads. Oh no, these
No, they're totally different.
Deerfield Wind, which is currently, they've now destroyed 2 ridge lines for the wind turbines there in U.S. Forest Service land. We recently saw something we've never seen before, which is the blasting records. And they were doing blasts, 11,000 pounds. There was one 23,000 pound blast.
Wow.
These, you know, quarries in Vermont, 2,500 pounds, 6,500, maybe 10,000. But to see this is going up, they're basically mountaintop quarries, and so they have all of the attributes of quarries up on top of our mountains, in some cases above 3,000 feet. And these are our purest waters in the world. I mean, this is where the water comes down and it gets absorbed into the ground, and it recharges the groundwater and the streams. And so all these cycles are interrupted, and also all the wildlife cycles are interrupted. So what people say around a lot of these mountains now is that the wildlife have moved downhill. You might see occasional wildlife up there, but the life has been taken out of it. And so that's what we don't want to be doing.
Doesn't the legislature get this?
No,
Well, why?
because the mantra has been for at least a dozen years that we don't have time for the conversation. We have to build renewables and get off fossil fuels, and we just have to build everything everywhere, and that's the only way to save the planet. And
Maybe
it's been bought lock, stock, and barrel, and it's coming from a place of fear that we have to do everything, and we can't even talk about the issues.
Yeah, never mind, we haven't discussed the health issues and all the other things to the individual. Right?
Well, and I think to the point you made about Vermont potentially being a refuge for people fleeing climate disasters and disaster areas, and the water resources that we have here. We have several lakes that are in really bad shape, and if we don't, we're in a similar situation there, where if we don't turn the needle soon, we might completely lose control over keeping Lake Champlain and other, Lake Carmi and other lakes, Memphremagog and all these others. We're at a tipping point where we may very well lose them and not be able to get them back for generations.
It's much harder to remediate
Yeah.
than it is
Well,
to
I
stop
think if
it
you're
in the
talking
beginning.
with all the runoff from these mountains, that's not helping either, right?
Well, there are new stream channels being cut. There's new sediment that's going to be going into the river,
Right.
and this is endless. It just
Yep,
keeps
just
going
keeps
and going, and the stream channels have moved far into the woods now. These new stream channels.
So for people listening, because we've had several shows, and I must say every once in a while, from the show, I think, well, we're making progress. Something's happening. Could either one of you just explain, and this might be too hard to do, where are we right now in this whole discussion? Legislature's not paying attention. Developers are trying to move along and get their projects developed. Is there a way to summarize this so people know where we are? And we have, let's see, 2 hours, and
Well,
just kind of summarize, because I actually haven't seen much in the paper. Maybe I'm missing something, but I haven't seen a lot. About a year ago, there was every other day on Lowell, and there was just something and all of a sudden it seems to be a little quiet, which must get you worried because you know something's going on
Well,
behind
we've
the
actually
scenes.
had a lot going on with that
Have
wind
you?
noise rule, so that's
Oh,
been
the noise rule.
occupying.
And that was
and-
at Alcar, right? Yeah.
and through the PUC.
Yeah.
But let's see if Mark can
Yeah,
summarize
okay, Mark,
where
you're
we
on.
are.
Well, I think we're at an interesting point where people are beginning to question, Vermonters are beginning to question the intrinsic good of renewable energy. You know, there are places where energy generation does not belong. We have not been, in Vermont, we have not been doing a good job protecting those places. You brought up the wildlife linkage issue. There is an internationally recognized wildlife linkage that extends into Vermont. It's been identified by the Staying Connected initiative. If you go online and Google Staying Connected initiative, you'll be presented with this set of maps, a set of critical areas that have been identified as crucial wildlife migration corridors and connective tissue that ties all of our northern wildlife habitats together. And interestingly, the Lowell Mountain turbines fragment that. And there was going to be another project, the project that got me involved in this initially, which was called the Seneca Mountain Wind Project, that was going to fragment another important component of this staying connected linkage. And this is what we've been doing, and people are beginning to catch on that these developments are not intrinsically good, that there are places that we need to protect, and I think Vermonters are becoming more and more concerned that we're not protecting them.
And so it's almost all this year about noise, because I even looked in the bills. There wasn't many bills. It's mostly an Alcar over the noise. What's?
Well, what
kept you all
happened
busy?
in the 2016 session, at the end of that year, was that legislation was passed that we certainly didn't want, because we had gone to the legislature on the noise issue because the Public Service Board had failed. And what did the legislature do? Sent us back to them to develop a rule. And so under the previous chair, a new rule was developed, and it initially, as the draft rule, was actually pretty good. It was a 35 decibel limit at night,
Right.
and 10 times
Was that
total
what
height
you were
setback.
promoting, or
Yes,
promoting? Were
yes.
you?
We brought in an expert who made the case. And then after that was put out as the rule, and that's the rule on which public hearings were held, we saw a certain number of gimmicks from wind proponents, like that they would show up at a hearing with a noise meter and say, well, look, this
No
proposed
noise.
level is higher than what we have here in this room, which is irrelevant. And so the Public Service Board first raised the nighttime level to 39, and then it went to the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules, which was very clearly stacked with wind proponents from the legislature. And the new chair of now what's called the Public Utility Commission saw that they didn't have the votes to get it through, so offered to remove the setback part of it. So the rule was effectively gutted because the setback was something that was enforceable. It was a first screen. We saw that from the existing projects.
And that's to make sure that it's set back from houses, right?
Right.
From where people are living,
Yeah.
that it's got to be back a certain amount of
Right,
whatever.
so right
feet.
now they're talking about 499-foot tall turbines, so it would be 4,990 feet, which we have had people outside of that distance who've been horribly harmed by them already, but at least it would have been protective of that first cut, and it would have stopped some of the worst projects from even moving forward. But with that removed, it's been a green light for the wind industry, and they basically have been winning all along in terms of assuring that Vermonters are going to get harmed by wind turbines, and the industry and their supporters absolutely will not admit there's a problem and will not have a conversation about how we might address
These
the
are
problems.
Vermonters who are going before them and talking, right?
It's 8.5 years of watching this get
Right.
nowhere. I mean, we understand very well the issues these things put out audible noise, low frequency noise, and infrasound. And not everybody's affected. Different people are affected differently. The noise is different on different days. It's not bad all the time, but it disrupts people's sleep. It causes health issues. Just by sleep deprivation enough, you can have serious health issues. And we've seen enough of what's happened around these mountains to make better choices than have been made in the recent time. And the LCAR issue was unbelievable, because normally, this committee deals with lots of rules, and they might spend half an hour on a rule. Maybe a hot rule would be an hour. I don't know. 10 hours.
Wow. I bet it was
Four-
standing room only in the room.
4 different hearings. Well, there were about 24 people in green vests at each one, citizens who came out during a workday on a Thursday to sit and watch our legislators. There are 8 members on LCAR. So what was so interesting at these 4 sessions that LCAR held was that the legislators never asked any questions about, is this going to help Vermonters? Is this going to be more protective of Vermonters? Every question was about, how is this going to hurt the wind industry?
Oh, that's not a good question.
And this went on meeting after meeting after meeting, where we saw no concern whatsoever, for the very reason that we were there, was that there had been a unanimous vote in the House that people recognized that the standards that we had in place were not protective of enough, and they were supposed to come up with standards that were more protective. And our legislature is very much in the pocket of the wind industry.
Well, I think whenever you have a regulatory body like the Public Utility Commission, who is saying, how is this going to affect, how do we mitigate the effects of this on the industry that we're regulating? That's a problem, right? Because your job is to make sure that, the entities that you're regulating are acting in the best interest of the public, not that, you're helping them.
Well, actually, the PUC members and staff who were present did speak in terms of the goal is 30 decibels in the bedroom so people can sleep. They were on the right track.
Right.
They were saying the right things. It was the questions from the legislators that were all about, is this going to hurt the wind
Where's
industry?
the Public Service Board in all of this? Some of the things I've read, they're really dismissive of Vermonters.
Well, the past board was. Now, they've changed the name, and it just happened that there was a new chair at the change. And we are seeing some better process
really good.
as a result of the new chair. There were real issues with applications that were being accepted and moved forward that were not complete, and he's fixing that.
Oh, good.
So that
Who's the new chair?
his name is Anthony Roisman,
Oh, yes.
and
read that.
he's an attorney who has often been on the side of the little guy, and he's done energy
Good for him.
work, and he's a brilliant and very highly ethical attorney.
Excellent.
And
We hope he watches this show.
Yes, really. We love you, Anthony.
We'll send them a link.
But he's there to implement the law, and so if wind projects come forward that comply with all the criteria, he's going to have to approve them. But at least we feel as though there's a harder look being taken at these things, and that the issues are being handled better.
Right.
So, Mark, I was really struck by some of the testimonials that you have in your website. I had a chance to look through, and there's probably a dozen testimonials from people that have seen health impacts from wind turbines and other projects that really have been ignored by the media in a large part, as well as the regulators in this industry. How do we get those voices to be heard?
Well, that's what we tried to do. We, Energize Vermont, launched the Vermont Neighbors Project to provide a forum for turbine neighbors to tell their stories. And that's what we have. It's vtneighbors.org if you're at home and want to check it out. And we have stories from Vermonters telling what it's like to live next to a wind turbine. The problem that we were trying to solve with that was to hear people in their own words telling what it's like. The industry has minimized the impacts that their operations have on neighbors, and they've ridiculed the neighbors. One wind developer started abusing a group that was formed for turbine neighbors to get together And the developer intruded upon that site and was abusive and ridiculing of the people who were talking about the very real problems that the proximity of wind turbines, what those operations were doing to them.
Because we've heard stories where people have had to sell their houses and move.
Or abandon their home.
Or abandon their home because nobody wants to buy them, right?
And Annette, you were helping a man in Sutton who was working through some of these types of issues. I think he had a lawsuit, or
He still does.
He still does have a pending lawsuit around noise complaints that he had in his home. And is there any has there any success on the legal end of it, or is there still kind of?
He had a suit in federal court, and when the noise issue finally got taken up, he filed a complaint in November of 2011 or December of 2011. They finally picked up his complaint in like 2015 or 2016. So then the industry's lawyers were able to move his federal case back to the PSB until some monitoring took place. This is insane. He's spent over $300,000 now, and he's trying to get his case back in federal court. But meanwhile, they've had to do new monitoring, even though I don't think they ever should have had to. It's endless, and that project started up at the end of 2011, so 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, nearly 6 years, and the other two projects started up a year later, so nearly 5 years. There has not been one single noise complaint resolved at the Public Service Board, or now what we call the Public Utility Commission. And people have quit complaining because what's the point? There have been hundreds of complaints, but nothing was ever taken up by the previous chair in any meaningful way. When things were taken up, there was one neighbor of Georgia Mountain who finally got a case taken up, took nearly 2 years, and was dismissed. And the things they go through to try and determine whether there is compliance, this is absurd, but for the first year they have required 4 periods of 2 weeks of monitoring. And so, winter, spring, summer, fall. So then if you complain about a noisy evening in September, then they say, okay, we're going to go back to look at that data to try and find a similar circumstance with wind speed, wind direction, and power output and weather that is similar to your complaint. Well, so they came up with something that was in, I don't know, June. Well, June isn't September, and this is like absurd. It's just like looking at 4-year-old data to try and figure out if there was a violation, and it came within 5/10 of being where they would have to take it up, but with a rounding error, they were able to show that.
What's the underlying issue here? I mean, there's got to be, it's all over in state government and legislature, there's a resistance to listening and learning. Is it because we have set goals that I think is in statute, right, where we have to be at a certain place at a certain manner?
Well, I think
they just want to reach
the
that to the point?
responsibility for this, what I've just described, is clearly on Governor Shumlin, who turned our state agencies into permitting entities and just basically said, step on the accelerator and don't let anything stand in the way.
But
now,
that shouldn't impact the courts, I say naively.
Oh, the court system, it's all very, I'll use the word, it's very corrupt. This wind industry is one of the most corrosive industries that I've ever seen in terms of its ability and it's partly about money, but it's also, this idea that we have to do everything everywhere, and that's symbolic that we're building these machines with 3 blades, and that's showing that we're doing something, and so that we have to do more of it. And until I was in favor of wind energy when I first got involved in the issue, and once you start learning about the issues, the more you learn, the more the house of cards starts to fall apart. But it is something that's been very deeply sort of promoted to Vermonters, and now Governor Scott is making a difference. It's slow, as one of his appointees said to me. What Shumlin did when he came in was he went and did a 180. Now, how would you feel, or how would anyone feel if Governor Scott came in and did this? So he's just trying to right the ship back to getting some good government. And it's a big task, given what 6 years of this kind of, rah-rah, full speed ahead does to
Well,
state.
I had a woman on who lived in Lowell, and she was on the show. And she's just a regular person, like me. There's no reason for her to say the things she's saying unless it's absolutely true. There's no hidden agenda. There's no nothing. She's just a regular mom and a wife and wants to live in her house without feeling sick. And I was very impressed with her testimony. And she said nobody's paying attention.
That's right.
So, and this is not just a not in my backyard type of thing where they don't want to look out their back window and see wind turbines. Like, there was resistance to that, like Vermont Yankee, for example. A lot of people are like, we don't want that in our backyard. And, it's very difficult to show any, but in that situation, it's very difficult to show any health impacts from having a generation plant like that. This is an instance where there's multiple examples of people who have noise complaints, who have health impacts, who have actual examples of being negatively affected by
Oh, it's just a few people.
just a few people.
Yeah, just,
Well,
Yeah.
then
What
the
they
irony
say.
is these are built in some of the most remote areas where not many people live, and so then it's like, oh, but since when are we sacrificing people? And the same issue is playing out all over the world, and it's an urban versus rural issue where the people who live in the urban areas, who are the voters, and this is a big problem in Vermont, where Burlington really is controlling our legislature, both House and Senate, then they don't have a wind
Sure.
resource in
Right.
Burlington,
Yeah, I don't
actually.
care.
And so they see no problem with putting it in someone else's neighborhood. So
Right.
it's more like a yes in your backyard.
Well, because
Well-
they've been convinced that this is saving the planet.
with fewer people. And they,
Well, it's the analogy is destroying the village to save it.
Right.
We're destroying the environment in order to preserve it, and it just doesn't work. And there's a study that our Agency of Natural Resources in Vermont put out, talking about the dangers of fragmentation, and they identify, I think they identify 7 reasons that we're allowing this to happen, or that this is happening. And one of the reasons is that fewer and fewer people in Vermont appreciate the outdoors. They don't appreciate the value of mountains. They don't appreciate
Right,
the importance of intact ecosystems. So if you don't appreciate it, we can destroy it.
Yeah, and I had a similar moment to Pat. So I have a background in political science, but in a previous life I actually did electrical engineering, and one of the things that really struck me, I came in with a similar view of renewable energy. We have to build, get off of fossil fuels. And there's 2 things that struck me coming into the wind issue. The first one was how much energy you lose pushing it through a line. So if you're building wind turbines out on
Far from Lowell.
Lowell Mountain, which is not near anything.
Or even worse, the U.S. Forest Service land in southwestern Vermont
Exactly.
is not near anything.
That so little of that power that you're generating, which is not baseload power, which is another issue, is the wind only blows X number of hours per day, and it varies a lot. So you have to have another source of power that can ramp up and down quickly with it, which is a whole other issue. But transmitting it,
Called gas.
which is called natural gas usually, because it's the
The
only
more
one.
wind
that
you
can
want in Vermont, the more natural gas you better
Yeah.
want too.
And it's not the efficient type of natural gas that you have to pair with it, because that one doesn't ramp quickly.
You have to build new gas plants.
You have to build new
More
gas
efficient
plants.
gas plants.
And so what you have to push it through this line, 50, 60, 70, 100 miles to get it to. So the amount of power you're actually generating that's reaching the end user is very, very minimal. Unlike solar, which you can put almost anywhere, particularly rooftop solar, your line's going 20 feet to your power box.
So it turns out that living off-grid with solar for 30 years it was a really valuable experience in terms of understanding
You
how
know what you're
renewable
talking
energy
about.
systems work. So I
Right.
got my batteries, I got my generator, and I got the solar panels. And so we're now hearing the words microgrid and off-grid, and instead of this big grid model where you just throw industrial-sized things up on the grid and then you have all these line losses and other issues, and you're building far from load, if you start to think about building close to load, and then upscaling from what I'm doing rather than trying to downscale from the
Right.
big grid, it makes a whole lot more sense. And it's doable on a Vermont scale because our needs are so small compared to the rest of New England. And if we had just started right to do what we might call the low-hanging fruit, let's do rooftop, let's really penetrate Burlington with the
Right.
highest population density. There are smart ways for us to build out a system here in Vermont. We
Is
haven't
it
been
too
doing
late for us now to
No, but
to
it means
refocus?
changing policies. I mean, most people don't understand that Vermont's renewable energy policy, as passed in Act 56,
Right.
our renewable energy standard, has 3 tiers. The third tier is your heat pumps, and electric vehicles. Your second tier is what's required to be built in state and retire the renewable energy credits. That's 10%. The rest, that 75%, is Tier 1, and that can be met with alternative compliance payments based on the low value of Hydro-Quebec's environmental attributes.
Right.
And
Yep.
so that doesn't mean 75% of our goal is being met by building renewables in Vermont. And so this is a policy that needs to be reworked if we're going to start looking at how to actually meet Vermont's needs instead of trying to just build into a regional grid.
So here's an interesting question. I think it kind of leads into what you were just saying. Where is the finish line, right? Vermont is almost, if you look at the amount of carbon that we emit into the atmosphere every year compared to the amount of carbon that our forests absorb every year, we're almost at a net zero now. We're about 60 to 80 tons of carbon a year offset. Where is the finish line? Is it when you get to overall global net zero, or is it when you get to 100% renewable?
Well,
They're smiling.
the finish line is different for different people. I think the finish line for David Blittersdorf is 200 miles of ridgeline wind in Vermont. I don't know what the finish line is. For me, for Energize Vermont, the finish line is a rational, sustainable energy plan that protects our environment and respects our communities.
And I presume you support Annette's discussion about smaller energy producing wind, like solar on houses and that sort of thing, rather than what we're doing now?
Sure. And solar has a lot of advantages over wind. For one thing, that you can scale solar down. You can't scale wind down. In fact, wind is going in the other direction. In order to make wind more profitable for the developers, the turbines are getting bigger and bigger. The latest turbines are over 700 feet tall?
Yeah, at the Renewable Energy Vermont conference, there was a workshop on wind, and there was a man from Vestas there, and he said the solution for Vermont is our new 4 megawatt or 4.2 megawatt turbine that has lower audible decibel levels, but of course it's the V156, so it would be a 156 meter blade. And I looked up the tower height, and the whole thing would be 790 feet tall, which I don't think is a solution for Vermont, partly because the wind industry has also said that for some reason that I don't understand, they're kind of capped at 500 feet. But still, they're looking at bigger generators that will produce more of the low frequencies that will go out further and impact more people.
Is there anywhere in the world where this works? I know in Denmark, I think it's Denmark, the towers go like this. They're like little spiral things. I thought they were kind of cool looking.
They're vertical axis turbines. The response from the wind industry is that they're producing kilowatts, not megawatts, and you'd have to have so many of them. But the fact is that these machines you couldn't sell to hardly anybody anymore because they're just too big, and what we've witnessed in like last year when Iberdrola was pushing the Wyndham Grafton project. It's really painful to sit through the sales pitches that are given to people where, Vermonters are asking good questions. What's the frequency of the noise? How low does it go? And they don't get a good answer.
Right.
I go up to the guy and I say, good question. How do you know to ask that? I work in the music acoustics business. Vermonters are asking good questions, but the industry won't give good answers and they won't give honest answers. And so in my work, what I have tried to do with contentious issues is sit down and talk to the other side and try and find a path where we can find a way to solve a problem. And when you're working on an issue where the other side won't admit there's a problem and absolutely refuses to talk because there is no problem, we're basically stuck.
We must have stories to tell from other states that had started this before us, where same issues, the health, we've been talking about this now, well, my show's been on for almost 3 years, and it's the same, the same discussion.
The first thing I did was go to a 50 turbine project in Cohocton, New York. Met with a neighbor. He said, I signed a lease. They told us there would be no noise.
Yep.
Things started up and I can't, and he's got a gag order on him. He said, I'm talking anyway
Oh, wow.
because, this thing is putting out 80 decibels and my wife can't sleep, and this property we own goes back to the Revolutionary War. And
Sure.
so it's an ugly business.
Yeah.
And, for Vermonters, I think the other piece that we all need to look at is if there is a solution piece, like what's the finish line? Well, if you live the way I live, you use less power. And you don't just, turn on every light and leave your computer on all night. And, I turn everything off at night.
Right.
A lot of people don't. People leave their printers on. I use my
Bad.
printer and I turn it off.
Yeah.
I mean, there are simple things like that that happen when you're responsible for your own power.
Right.
And your own usage. But now the spin is we're all going to drive electric cars. We're all going to heat our houses with air source heat pumps. I'm sorry, I'm not running an air source heat pump at night. I'm turning off my power at night.
Right.
So there are some real challenges in taking this capitalist system that we have and maintaining it at this level that we are, and the idea that we're all going to just do it all with electricity, which would require massive amounts of destruction for development
Right.
of wind and solar, and then the technologies are changing so fast that this whole idea of 90% renewable by 2050 is like, well, where's your crystal ball?
Right.
Do you know what
Right.
the technology is going to be
Exactly.
tomorrow? Let alone in how many years is that? So
Right.
There's so much better. I mean, and I think that's a good point. Is the industrial and commercial photovoltaic cells, the solar panels, have until today operated at 12 to 15% efficiency. The high-end panels, that's where they're at, 12 to 15% efficiency. They just developed one with 30% efficiency. That's able to be produced commercially. And so this is a world that's changing very quickly. I mean, you can now, if these panels in the next year or two make it to market, you can get twice as much power off of a rooftop solar array, which is game changing. If you can get twice as much power out of a rooftop solar array.
somebody's figured out how to create solar with glass.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. You
I
have
mean,
windows now that are
Yeah.
producing it. You
There's
have
been a lot of R&D
that makes
put
a
into
lot of
solar.
sense.
So, the wind industry doesn't have the same promise in terms of new technologies that are going on this large scale. They just keep scaling them up. And
Well, it's the only option, because there are physical limits, theoretical limits to the amount of energy that you can extract from wind, and theoretical limit to the amount of energy you can get from sunlight. And we're much further away from that theoretical limit with solar than we are with wind. We're very close to the theoretical maximum with wind. So the only way that you can improve the economies is to make them bigger.
Right. Yeah. So you get a bigger turbine. So what other? We've talked about a couple technologies, solar primarily. At the end of the day, wind is one of the largest sources of renewable energy that we have. What other sources do you see coming up other than solar that's a viable alternative to wind?
well, solar is our best resource. I think in a lot of the energy meetings I've been in Vermont, it's rare that someone doesn't bring up hydro.
Right.
And I've looked at some small hydro, because a lot of us have streams, and there may be some interesting things coming along there. Not big new dams, but in-stream that can do sort of, if I could get a small hydro producer of some sort into my stream, it would trickle charge my batteries, and I would never have to use the gas generator again. But all these technologies, like solar and wind, they're not green. They're not non-toxic.
Right.
And electric vehicles too. Rare earth minerals are one of the most toxic things to be extracting, and that's on just decimating villages in China. So we need to, if we're talking about sustainability in Vermont or resilience, these are sort of the buzzwords. We need to and we're going to make a difference in terms of the global climate, then we really need to take responsibility for the inputs that are global too, and not just be looking at it from a perspective of, well, wind and solar by themselves are green, and so that's the answer. Well, it's a very simplistic conversation, and almost every meeting I go to, it's like, it's on Vermont to figure out how to generate all the electricity we need. And
champions.
And I'm
our
not sure
little state.
that's our job.
Now
How can we work together as a community?
There's a
That's a
concept.
better question.
Yeah. You're on the governor's Climate Action Commission,
No,
right?
I'm
On the
not.
technical.
I was named co-chair of the technical
Right,
advisory
and
group.
you are not now on it, or?
Well, I'm co-chair, but there's
Oh.
nothing to do.
Oh.
The role was pretty much usurped by the co-chair of the Climate Action Commission. So I don't have a voice. I don't have a seat on the commission. I have nothing
That's
to do.
not good.
It's very strange. Yeah.
So do that. So he had appointed this group to do climate action, and I presume
So there's a commission.
report back, and then they had
And they have a
you
technical
on as a
advisory
technical,
group.
and the technical advisory group is not active. Not-
There's the way it was set up was that there are two of us that are co-chairs, me and Kevin Jones from Vermont Law School, and if the Climate Action Commission needs resources that are not available to them, they are to come to the co-chairs to present.
I see.
To provide the resources.
So
But-
somehow the chairs
but-
never
but
come
They,
to
the way
they don't
that-
need any of your help yet?
But the way that it's been set up is that if you have some expertise that you want to offer,
Right.
then you write to the Deputy Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources, and he takes your name. So there's this whole list of people who are on the technical advisory group, and I don't know who most of them are, and I have no idea what
That
their
doesn't
experience
sound
is.
like something very efficient. Maybe they
certainly-
should look at that, fix it.
So it is there was a bunch of fuss about, VNRC and VPIRG got all upset, and in fact, a UVM professor, John Erickson, was quoted in 7 days calling me anti-renewable and saying he won't serve on the technical advisory group because I'm on it.
Really?
Oh, there was a great amount of attack leveled at me and the governor's office for this appointment, which then turned into something completely meaningless.
How sad.
Yeah, so I don't know. I was happy to be asked. I was happy to serve, and I had expected that I would
think
be
you're
doing
a font
more.
of information for
Well,
sure.
According to some people, I don't know anything.
And you were, I read that you were pleased with the governor's stance on climate change, or not. I looked.
No, I'm pleased with
Yeah,
what Governor Scott has
Yeah.
has done, the positions that he's taken. He supports renewable energy, but he recognizes that there are places where large-scale development just
Right,
should
can't-
not take
right,
place.
Agree with them there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I know both of your organizations, one of your focuses is trying to get people engaged in the political process, make sure that their voices are heard. How do you do that? And how do you encourage people who may be watching to get involved and to ask questions? Where do they go?
Well, they can go to the Vermonters for a Clean Environment website or the Energize Vermont website. The education, a well-informed public is essential in this, and we need to make sure that people are asking the right questions, that they know the right things. As I said before, what we need to be thinking about is what are the impacts of climate change going to be on Vermont, and what can we do about those impacts? We can't do anything about global concentrations of greenhouse gas, but what we can do is anticipate what's going to happen in Vermont and start to preserve our defenses and enhance our defenses against those impacts.
That's great. And you all are around publishing where people can come and listen and learn, right?
Yeah, did a radio program a
yeah.
couple weeks ago. It's, trying to reach out to the public is something that we don't really do. People come to us and
I think the people that I talk to are interested in learning. It's not a topic that they're turning their backs to. This is really serious. Before we end, I know you wanted to talk about the opportunity for employment in the. That was something I read just the other day too. That you were a little vocal about the 20,000 jobs.
WCAX posted a story and ran it about the new wind noise rule, and the last line in it said that the spokesperson at that point for the wind industry said that the wind industry was responsible for 20,000 jobs in Vermont. And when I read that, I wrote to the reporter and said, that's crazy. Global Foundries, 2,000 jobs?
Right.
And it's more like maybe 14 or 15 jobs that the wind industry has in Vermont. Well, I heard from the reporter this morning, and she said that she had checked her notes and she had misunderstood.
Oh.
And that referenced all the renewable energy jobs. And, well, that's not quite true either, because this is a self-reporting done to the Department of Public Service. I think the last number we heard was 16,000,
Well,
but of which maybe 1,200 or 2,000 are renewable energy jobs.
It's actually called clean energy jobs, and those clean energy jobs can be installing very efficient equipment, installing
So they want
insulation.
broad definition.
Well, yeah. I
Most
mean,
of them, but it's energy efficiency, I
Right,
think.
and the energy industry likes to point at that and say and claim that those are their jobs,
Right.
and they're not.
Yeah, and Governor Shumlin used those numbers
Yeah, because
also.
I've heard that
Absolutely.
at a campaign
Yeah.
or two.
Well,
Yeah.
this does go to the bigger problem that we've had in this state on these issues, and that is that the wind industry is very good at spin, and they just keep saying it,
Right.
and then people believe it.
And people, you say it enough times and people believe
Exactly.
it.
They believe it themselves.
Yeah.
We've sort of run out of time. I thank you both very much. I think we could keep talking for quite a while. Thank you for listening in. We'll see you next week. And in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Went fast.
Something I kept telling people